Hey, good evening. Welcome to the Same Team Marriage Large Group. So glad you're here. You excited to be here tonight? Yeah, awesome. Well, welcome online. This is the final night of the Same Team Marriage Large Group. The last couple of weeks have been awesome, and tonight we're kind of finishing with a crescendo. We're talking about intimacy, and it's a really important topic, obviously, for marriage, and I'm thankful that we have a professional who's going to kind of explain it to us. I wonder if he's going to draw us a picture or something like that, but Jason Van Ruler is here, so he's going to share about intimacy for a little while here, and then we will go into a kind of a breakout time with you and your significant other. It'll be an abbreviated breakout time, about 10 minutes, so especially online, make sure you hang out for that 10 minutes, because after that 10 minutes, we're going to come back together, and we have a bunch more content. We got a lot of questions throughout the week and last week that we are going to try to answer kind of head on, so that we make sure that we provide as much value as possible to exactly what we need in the area of marriage. So that's what we're going to do tonight, and I could not be more excited. So we're going to get started here. If you join me in welcoming Jason on the stage here. Jason, what is up, bro?
Hey, man. Well, here we are. I am thrilled to be back. This has been a great series. I've had so much fun doing this, and so hopefully you've been helped by this. Tonight we're going to talk about intimacy, and it's going to get a little spicy in here, so I hope you guys are all ready for it. I asked initially for a projector because I wanted to make this kind of like a 7th grade gym class, but they were against it. So I'm using what I got, but that's what we're going to talk about tonight is intimacy. And I think for a lot of us, that word means different things. And so we're first going to talk kind of about what that word means. But what I'd like to do first is just turn to Scripture, because I think that's always a good way to kind of inform what we're about to discuss. I like 1 Thessalonians says, therefore, encourage one another and build each other up, just as in fact you are doing. And I chose that because I think when we talk about intimacy, that's really what it's about, is building each other up. I see a lot of couples and they talk about intimacy problems, and I think a lot of times what we miss is that it's a process and it's something that we help each other out with. And so to first kind of understand intimacy, I think we have to understand first that it's more than you think. Okay, so I don't know about you guys, but when I heard the word intimacy for a long time, I kind of thought just about one part of it, and that was the romantic or the sexual piece. And that part is really great and it's important, but there's actually 6 different parts to intimacy. And so we're going to talk a little bit about those. The first one, though, we'll talk about, because I think it's only fair, is physical intimacy. And physical intimacy is really important in a marriage and relationship because it's connection. I think the difficulty, though, is that if we're not careful, we end up kind of putting all our stock in one bucket. And so when I see couples sometimes that are struggling to connect in the physical intimacy department, a lot of times it's because we're lacking on the others. Or it's because we relied so heavily on this piece that then something changed and now we don't know what to do. So although I will tell you physical intimacy is really, really vital in a relationship, and that might mean sexual intimacy or touch or even just that romantic interaction, it's also something that we have to have other parts with. And so some of us are wired in a way where we could just survive on physical intimacy and not the others, but others of us are wired in a way that we need the other types. And if the other types are in line, then the physical piece goes along with that. I remember I went to a conference in Phoenix, and I was in an Uber on the way to a conference, and the Uber driver said to me, what do you do for work? Now, this is always like a super loaded question as a counselor, because it means you might have to give a lot of advice, or you might hear someone start crying, or it can be very uncomfortable. So for some reason, though, this day, instead of just saying nothing like I normally would, I really leaned into it. I'm like, I'm a counselor, and the guy's like, hey, what type of counseling? I'm like, oh, this is going to be bad. But I don't want to kill my Uber review. So I'm like, okay, relationships. And he's like, well, what is this conference about? What are you going to learn about or talk about? And I said, intimacy. And I kid you not, I hadn't even said the whole word yet. And the guy looked in the rearview mirror and had already winked at me. And I was like, this is big regret. This was a real mistake. This is going to be bad. And he proceeded to tell me that him and his wife were doing great in the intimacy department. Wink, wink. And so I'm just thinking, can I jump out of the car at 30 miles an hour and survive? Or what do I have to do to get through this? But I think what that showcases is how a lot of us look at this, which is just, it's all about sex. And that is, again, important, but we have to kind of expand our view of that in our relationships because sometimes it's not possible for really legitimate reasons, or sometimes there's a season where it's difficult. And so if we only lean on this, what happens then is we don't connect. And that's really, really a problem. So, okay, we have physical intimacy. We also have another part of intimacy, and that is the emotional intimacy. And I would say for a lot of people, this is just as important. Because if we don't have emotional intimacy, we're going to have a really difficult time with the physical piece. And what this kind of makes me think of is a lot of times we're just not really versed in how to have that emotional intimacy. And so we can start something, but we don't know how to finish it. Now, this is right outside my bathroom. I was taking a shower and got done and walked out, and I thought, oh, that's where I left the water on. And I looked up at the ceiling and realized that I did not leave the water on. There was just water running out of my ceiling. And so this is the way that I think about things. I thought to myself, I bought that really cool knife. I bet I could cut the ceiling with it. Now, this is always bad, right? If you see a problem and you think to yourself, like, I have a tool that I could use for this and this is going to be fun, it's a problem. But I did anyway. So I cut the hole, got the water turned off, and then promptly realized that I had no idea how to fix that. I just sort of cut a hole there. Now I have no clue. There's a big hole in my ceiling, and this is a problem. And I think for a lot of us with emotional intimacy, we kind of approach it the same way. We might know how to dance around it, or we might know how to start a conversation, but we don't really know what to do then. And so like me, you might now just walk down your hallway and pretend it's not there. I don't think Jody does that. She knows it's there, but I try to pretend it's not there because I don't know what to do with it. And so this emotional intimacy part is really, really important, especially if we want the physical piece. We have to know what to do with that. We can't just kind of avoid it. And I think if we're not careful or we haven't had someone show us, it can be easy and tempting even to just kind of walk by it and avoid it. So we don't want to do that. We want to learn how to lean into that. The next piece that's really important when we're thinking about intimacy is talking a little bit about spiritual intimacy. And spiritual intimacy is really important in the sense that Paul Tillich said it's really the most important type of intimacy. We don't get anywhere without it. And so I'm thankful that everyone's here tonight because I think you guys are already on the path to that, to having that spiritual intimacy. But if you don't have that kind of connection, what happens is that we then are a long ways apart. Because if we don't share the same core values or we don't share the same thoughts on life and death and how we look at faith, it becomes very, very difficult. And so what we need to do is we need to try to grow that spiritual intimacy. So we're kind of working through the pieces. And what I'm going to tell you as we go through the pieces is that what we're really looking for is balance. It's not about having all of one and none of the other. It's about having balance between them. Because sometimes there's pieces that are going to be off. There's going to be difficult seasons. There's going to be times where you're just not connecting. And so we need to rely on the other ones then. But if we don't have those, we're in big trouble. The other one that we would talk about is the intellectual intimacy. And this is my son. This is actually me at seminary, so I've aged very well, as you can tell. Same handsome, good looks. And my son, he's always been a reader. And so I think he's actually reading Pascal at a very young age. But we share that together. We both really like to read. We both really like to connect intellectually and talk about ideas. And this is something with our relationships that I think we often overlook, is our shared interests and our shared intellectual discussions. I know I was kind of thinking about Jody and I, and we have literally like a 400-page book on making kombucha. Now, I will say that's not really my book, but I did give it a read. And so we share that together. We can talk about these ideas, and it's something that brings us closer. And so that's really, really important in a relationship, is to have that ability to connect, and not just over inconsequential things, but over ideas too. Another thing that we want to be really aware of with intimacy, and I kind of combined two, is creative and experiential intimacy. So experiential intimacy is traveling together, having experiences, doing things. And this is so vital to a relationship. And I think, unfortunately, with COVID, a lot of us have really struggled with that part because travel's been really restricted. And so we've had to be really thoughtful about how we do this. But that experiential piece is a huge piece of intimacy. Think about any big, memorable trip you've been on and the people that you've gone on that trip with. And you remember them, right? And you have connections that you don't have with other people because you experienced it together. And so we need to have that in our relationship more than just our wedding, right? Our wedding is a great thing to experience together, but we need to keep doing things. And then we have to have creative pursuits. And that could be about anything, really. For us, it was Jody's birthday, and it was a big birthday, and so I wanted to take her to do something that she would think was fun, that we have interest in. And so we actually, I wanted to go to one of the top restaurants in the world, and it was in the US, and so we went. I think it's called Seizen. And so we went there, and they had this whole like flight of food, which for me was not hot dogs or macaroni. So I was very confused with the whole thing. But this is what it was. So I think this was like sea urchin and something orange, something purple, something green, a bun of some kind, and there was no butter. But we sat there together, and it was a creative experience, right? Because these people spent hours making this thing that I ate in like a bite. And they had all these, I think this was made out of like a chicken named Bill at a farm in Oregon, and they told us about it. And so this was like this really amazing experience that just the two of us had. And so we need to have those in our marriage. We need to make those times and make those efforts to have creative pursuits. Now, other things that we can do are things like concerts, plays, things like that where we're going and we're doing it together. But we really need all of these things if we want to do intimacy well. Because if we don't have the ability to do all of these things, and it all kind of falls on one area, then we have a disconnect, especially if the intimacy that you're most comfortable with is, let's say, creativity, and your spouse is most comfortable with physical. That's really, really hard to put together. And so we need to become well-rounded. But in order to do that, we kind of have to have this realization about intimacy, which is that it really comes down to you first. Okay? When I see couples come in, they often say to me, Jason, what I really need is for them to be this way. I need them to have more intimacy with me. We need to have more intimacy in our relationship. And the hard truth of that is that it's really, really difficult to have that with somebody if you don't have good awareness and insight about yourself. It just is, because it's kind of cliche, but if we don't know how to do it for ourselves, it's really hard to give to somebody. And so when we think about intimacy, before we look at our relationship, we really have to look at ourselves. And that feels a little selfish in a way, but if we're not able to do that, we're not going to be able to meet our spouse or partner there. So as part of this, we want to then go and take an honest assessment of ourselves. And I know you're all reading this right now, and it does say underpants. But we want to take an honest assessment. A way that I like to take an honest assessment of where I'm at in my life is to go to the dermatologist. And this is really fun for me because they look for moles that might be cancerous. And they have actually found one. And so now I'm like kind of panicked and I have to go, like I can't even put it off. But what it means is that about every 6 months, I get to stand in front of a bunch of strangers in a little room in my underwear. And while that sounds like a lot of fun, it actually isn't. They take notes, they point at stuff. And what I realize about that is like I can totally tell if I've worked out or not worked out or how I'm feeling. Like there's no hiding anything. And I think that as uncomfortable as it is, and by the way, my dermatologist is fantastic, so she's really good about it. As uncomfortable as that is, we need to do that for ourselves. Now, I'm not saying to go home and stand in the closet in your underpants and invite friends over. That's not what I'm saying, because that's weird. But what I am saying is that we need to stand with some vulnerability and kind of look at how are things actually looking. Not how do I want things to appear to other people or how do I think they should be, but how does it really look? Who am I really? Because that question is going to be so important if we're going to have intimacy with somebody else, is we have to know some of that. And so as part of that, once we get done with the underpants in the closet, we have to try to know ourselves. And knowing ourselves takes work. And that sounds odd, but it really does. Because some of us have a very surface level view of who we are and what we think and why we think that. And so it becomes really hard to share that with people because we kind of run out because we don't know. And so I had an experience that was really funny not that long ago, actually, where I went to the gym. And I like to go to the gym when I'm barely conscious because I just feel like it makes it easier. If you just go to the gym, you're half awake, get it over with, it's better. But I went and I ran into somebody that I hadn't seen for a long time. And they looked at me and they said, "Do you know Jason Van Ruler?" I look at them, I'm like, "I think so." And they kind of say it again. They say, "Do you know Jason Van Ruler?" And at this point, like my mind is blown. I'm like, does anyone know Jason Van Ruler? Does Jason Van Ruler really, like, is this a weird dream? I should have washed my face. And then they kind of say it in a frustrated, they're like, do you know Jason Van Ruler? And I'm like, I'm Jason Van Ruler? But I'm not sure, right? I'm not sure. I'm literally asking this person, am I really this person? And it really made me think, like, do I really know me? Now, they were asking if I knew my cousin, which I do know my cousin, so they were just confused because they were also unconscious. But the moral of that story is that how often do we think about really if we know ourselves? Do we know what makes us tick? Do we know what's important? Do we know what makes us cry? Do we know what hurts us? Do we know what makes us laugh? Because if we don't know that, it's hard, again, to connect with our partner. And so we want to know ourselves better. By the way, I think this picture is awesome. This is my son just looking out, just doing kid stuff, I guess. But to me, it made me think about that. How often do we look out over our lives and just try to understand ourselves better? The other thing that we need to do as we grow in intimacy is to understand our personality. Now, I know some of you are probably familiar with the Enneagram. That's one personality assessment. There's the MMPI and all these other ones. And they're all great in the sense that they tell us about ourselves. They tell us about traits. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean this is who we are, but it informs us. And with that information, we can then have a better understanding of ourselves and how we interact with our partner. I did the Enneagram, and I'm sure you guys are all shocked, but I'm a helper. As a counselor, it seems really weird. Like, I don't know why I do that job. And I'm caring, interpersonal, generous, demonstrative, and then I cross out all the negative crap, because that part is not true. So I'm everything positive, none of the negative stuff. I'm kidding. That part is true, too. People-pleasing and possessive. Ugh, that's gross. But people-pleasing and possessive. And so what I get from that is I understand why I do some of what I do. And I understand how that sometimes really helps relationships, like that really makes up for things. And I also understand how that gets in the way sometimes. And so if you haven't done this sort of thing, I think it's important to do because you have to have that understanding of your personality and what really guides you. Without that, we're just sort of aimlessly wandering along. And then it makes it really, really difficult to go to our partner and kind of talk about who we are and what we need. Which, speaking of that, the next step in doing all of this is knowing how to meet your needs. And of course, Swedish fish are how I meet my needs. I like to eat red wax, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I'm kidding, sort of. So I started going to Nashville a couple of years ago to do intensive workshops, and it's been super rewarding for me. I really, really enjoyed it. But what I've noticed is that it's kind of like, literally it's intense. I mean, it's intensive, if you will. And so I get there and I just kind of work solid for days and days, and then I come home. And what I noticed is that when I would come home at night, I would often be exhausted, just emotionally drained. And that's just part of the job, and that's okay. But if I wasn't careful, what I'd do is I'd come home to my family, and they'd be excited to see me, and I would not. I'd actually just be like in a funk. And it would be really, really bad because they'd have a hard time, especially for my kids, kind of understanding how I could be gone and then not really be that glad to be home. But the truth was, it wasn't that I wasn't glad to be home. I was just really, really tired. And so I determined that what I needed to do is find a way to kind of meet this need for, I would say, some rest and kind of pep up my mood a little bit and reflection. And so what I came up with is Swedish fish, which I don't eat that often, but they're awesome. And so that had to be step one. And then The Office, because that's almost always funny and puts me in a good mood. And then a journal to write down what I took away from my experience. And so I learned on the flight home that it was really imperative that I did all of that because it's what I needed. Okay, now Jody says the Swedish fish are not a need, but I strongly disagree. But that is what I needed in the moment, was I needed something that made me think of happy things, like the Swedish fish. I needed The Office, which will make me laugh, and I needed to be able to reflect. And so this ability is not something that I had really for very long, actually. It's something I've had to work up to. For a long time, I had no idea how to meet my needs. And when we have no idea how to meet our needs, we get into really dangerous water. Because sometimes we do what we did as a kid, or we do what feels good, and we don't do what's best for everybody. And so something I've had to learn is how to meet my needs in a way that is good for me, but also doesn't hurt other people and doesn't take away from my relationship. And so this is something that's really important to invest in, especially if we want intimacy with our partner, is knowing how to meet our needs. The next piece that we want to work on is to ask for what you need. Now, this is super hard, right? Because it is so much easier to tell other people what they need. In fact, I've made a career out of it. I love it. It's very wonderful. You just do it all day long. But it's really, really hard to ask for what you need for some of us. And I noticed this because I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but there's really two places that come to mind where this happens. But Subway and Trader Joe's are these types of places. And I love them both. But still, when you go into Subway, there's like this pressure. Like you go in and it's almost like there's a timer and you have to get through it really, really quickly. And so the way you get through it really, really quickly is you just do whatever's happening. Like I think I've agreed to like a tuna melt on half a sandwich with like jalapenos and mustard and 2 cups of mayo just because I thought it'd get me out of there faster. But we do that, right? And some of us go through our entire life rushed to get through because we don't want to bother anybody. We don't want to stop and say like, this is actually what I need because it could be an inconvenience. And for some of us, those are lessons we learned as a kid, right? That if we ask for what we need, like it would bother somebody, or they might not do it, or that it's unfair or selfish of us to do that. And so for a long time, I think Subway actually loved me because they would pawn a bunch of crap off on me. I could just tell, like they knew. They're like, I don't know what's wrong with this guy, but whatever we tell him he's getting, he always gets it. Until one day, I went in and I said, I got to think about it for a second. But for me, that felt like the hardest thing to do in that moment was to say, I got to ask for what I actually need. And I know it's funny to talk about Subway, but it's actually not that funny when it's our real needs. Because a sandwich is one thing, and sandwiches are important, but our needs in our relationship, that's big stuff. And so if we don't know how to do that, it's really, really hard for other people to meet those needs. And it's really, really hard for other people to be let in. And so don't be like me, right? Don't stand at Subway and just take whatever you get out of life. Ask for what you need and take some time if you need to do that or if you need to figure it out. The next piece that we want to talk about is we need to practice frequently and consistently. Now, this is my fat bike. I love to tell people I have it because I think it sounds cool and it makes me sound like a really cool guy. I have a fat bike. The problem is I just don't ever really ride it. And so once or twice a year when I see it and I go, oh, that's really, really cool, I will go out and I will try to ride like 50 miles because I think that's what you're supposed to do with those is just ride like a lot of miles. And then inevitably I will come home and I will tell Jody that I don't feel well and I will lay in bed with leg cramps for like 3 days and just be miserable. And the reason is because you can't just go out and do like 50 miles on that without doing consistent practice. But I always think I can. And so intimacy is kind of like that too, and knowing ourselves is kind of like that. You can't just occasionally do it. You can't do it once a year. Say like, oh, okay, well, I did that. Yeah, check that off the list. It just doesn't work that way. It's something that we need to practice consistently. And if we do that, there's great reward in that because we get to know ourselves and our partner better. But you have to do it frequently and consistently. Otherwise, you're going to be like me. It's going to make you sick. You're going to lay around and your wife's going to wonder what's wrong with you. So if you do all of these things, what then we want to kind of talk about is the fact that it's a process and it's not a destination. We don't just have intimacy. Like that's not just a one-time thing that we have and then we're just good for a while. This is something that's ongoing. And so we don't want to kind of get into that place of thinking like, well, we just did that. Yeah, we were physical on Tuesday, so we're good for a little while. I've heard that a lot, right? And that's sometimes how we think. But it isn't how it should be. How it should be is that we're doing this all throughout. And not just the physical piece, but we're doing those other pieces too. And so along with it being a process, we want to remember some things that are going to be really helpful guides to us. And one of those things is that we want to remember that we need to just kind of be who we are. And if we are who we are, that's going to make it easy. And the interesting thing is that that's who our partner loves best anyway. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I have had an affinity for cranky old people for a really long time. I don't know what it is, but I really just like crabby old people. And part of the reason that I really love them is because they just are who they are. Okay, there's no, like they just have either gotten too old or too cranky to like try to pretend to be anybody else. And so, they burp talk and they do weird stuff or spill coffee all over or, say things that you're like, I can't believe you actually said that. But I kind of love all of it because somewhere, I think we all want to be that person. right? We all want to be that person, maybe not like Bernie, but we all want to be that person who is just who they are. You know, good old Bernie, I love this. By the way, too cheap to buy a Getty image, so I just drew it. So you're going to have to deal with it. It's Bernie Sanders if you didn't know. But what we all love about Bernie is that Bernie doesn't care what's happening, right? He's just in his parka and mittens. He's just hanging out. And I think that's what makes that image so shareable is just the fact that we can all relate. Like, we all want to be like that. Maybe different mittens, but we all want to be that way. And so if we can try to do this in our relationship, we can start to have more authentic experiences. The other thing that's helpful for us to kind of remember is that we want to be vulnerable first. And that's super hard. For some of us, it feels like being vulnerable is so risky that we just can't even bring ourselves to do it, right? Maybe we've had experiences where we've been vulnerable and it's ended really badly, and so we've decided that that's just not going to be for us. But if we want intimacy, we have to. I remember, along with doing these intensives, they said, yeah, we want to fly you down for an interview, and what we're looking for is like you to share your story for an hour. Like, just tell us about you. We want to know everything. And I literally said to Jody, I said, I don't think I want to go. She said, why not? And I said, the thing is like, I don't want to talk to him about me. I don't want to tell him all this stuff, because for me, that felt so scary to let people in. In fact, I'd been really, really good for a long time at never letting anyone in. And so this idea of like talking to people and letting them in just seemed beyond me. I had some advice from some good friends who told me that the best things lie just beyond that vulnerability, and so I went. And I shared, and it was weird, and I didn't really like it. But at the end, I felt better. And I now have friends today that I wouldn't have imagined having that know me better than anyone, and it's been really awesome to have that, but I wouldn't have volunteered. And so part of what we need to do in our relationship is we need to motivate each other and help each other to lean in and be vulnerable, even when it's difficult, because it is difficult. If you're sitting out there and you think to yourself, like, man, Jason, sounds good for you, but it's tough for me, I know. I literally was on a flight thinking to myself, I could just get off in Chicago and come home. It'd be easier. But I'm so glad that I leaned into it. So after we're vulnerable, what we want to do then is we want to be slow to anger, and we want to be patient and kind. I think I heard a Bible verse about that one time. But I think something that really captures that is my childhood dog, Chloe. What she lacks in brains, she makes up for with looks. And she has since passed on, but she was a wonderful dog. And she was the kind of dog that you have when you're a kid and you pull its tail and you poke it and you do a bunch of kid stuff that, really isn't cool for the dog. But, Chloe never bit her face off like we probably deserved. Chloe just looked at us and was like glad to be there and fun. And I think sometimes we take ourselves so seriously or we overthink situations so much that we lose some of the ability just to be present and just to have fun and just to laugh and to play and to not read so much into anything. And I think actually like animals do a fantastic job of teaching us about this because they are, like they're just in the moment. I think literally because they forget everything else, but they're just in the moment. And I think that we want to have that in our life. And somewhere along the line, we forget it. I think the Bible talks about kids and how, when we have that and we're pure and we're naive, that's just so much better. Because we have this ability, but it gets covered up by experience. And so to be intimate and to have this connection, we need to get that back. And we need to strive for it. Along with that, we also want to have positive role models. So maybe you're sitting out there today and you're saying to yourself, like, Jason, I don't know about any of this stuff. Like, I hear you, but it sounds like a bunch of counselor stuff to me. And I just want to tell you that you're not wrong, really. It is counselor stuff, but it's also doable. But if you don't know how to do it, you have to ask someone who does. And so that can be really challenging, but first we just have to reach out. And so when you're sitting there now and you're thinking about this, I want you just to think a little bit about who do you know that does this well? Do you know people who are able to be vulnerable and authentic and they lean into relationships? Because those are the people you want to ask to show you and to be your guide. And so I've been lucky enough, I've had a friend, Tony, and Tony's just like, in my book, he's just the best guy ever. And so he texted me this, I think it was last week. Hey, watching a replay of Man City game. He likes soccer, but he has terrible taste in teams. And listening to your Embrace Workshop, you're doing great. And he did that because he knew I'd be wondering how I did. Because he gets me, and he gets himself, and he knows how it works. And so when we really do this stuff well, and we have good understanding, we can then gift that to other people. And so if we don't know how to do this, what we do is we find people like Tony who are willing to show up in our lives, and we learn from them. Tony's taught me so much, and I don't even know if he meant to, but he's taught me so much about connecting with people and connecting in my marriage that I would not have known if I hadn't been friends with him. And so if you need people like this in your life, ask somebody how to find them. Or think of somebody that you know and go up and talk to them and say, how do you do that? Because it's vitally important. And once we do that, then give that back to somebody else who's sitting there unsure of what to do next. Okay? Because we can give that to other people too. If we do all of this stuff, really what it comes down to is having a relationship that's more connected than ever. And when I think about what we've talked about these 3 times, we talked about first communication, which is a way to connect. We talked about conflict, which gets in the way of connection. And then tonight we're talking about intimacy, which is true connection. And I think what I'm really asking you in all of this is to live outside of safe. I think safe in our marriage is good. That's okay, it's respectable, but it isn't really what most of us want. And I think also it's not really what God calls us to. I think God calls us to bold and risky. I think so much of, like Jesus, when he's interacting with the disciples and he's like, yep, just come follow me. Like that was bold and risky. There was nothing safe about that. And it changed everything because they took a risk. And so I think what we have to be careful of and what we want to do in our relationship is maybe you're nailing down safe. Maybe safe is you don't ever have fights. Maybe safe is you don't ever be too vulnerable. You don't ever share too much. You just have a routine. But I bet there's a piece inside of you that wants more. And I encourage you to chase it. It's messy sometimes, and you'll get it wrong, sometimes more than you get it right. But I think living that bold and risky marriage or relationship is what we're called to do. And I think through that, we have the greatest connection, and we have those relationships that stand the test of time. And so if you could take away something from this experience, I would just ask, try for bold and risky. You can always go back to safe. Safe's always going to be there. But bold and risky takes work. And how I know that this is important is that what I find oftentimes is when we're about to lose somebody, if you've ever had that experience where someone is dying, we realize towards the end, or maybe you have, I know I have, we realize towards the end that we played it safe our entire experience with them. We never really asked hard questions. We never really tried to know them too well or to lean into things that might be difficult. We just were safe. And so what's interesting is that when someone gets near their death, we then start to lean into bold and risky. And we find that these people that surrounded us or that we grew up with were particularly amazing. They were brilliant. But we didn't know that because all we ever tried for was safe. And so something that I learned early on in working with clients and just some of my own experiences is that you can't wait for bold and risky. Don't wait till the end. You can do it today. And it doesn't have to be some grand gesture. It can be just a question. And it can be a question that you don't even know how to answer or a question that you don't know where it's going to go. But you have someone next to you that cares about you, so lean into it. Be bold and risky. Don't wait. Thank you guys so much. I appreciate your time tonight.
Okay, so we are going to take just the next 10 minutes to break out with your partner. So in the room, find a safe place to do that at home. Again, make sure you hang out. Time flies when I'm having fun with my wife, though, so there's
That's sweet.
So we're going to hop into these questions that you all had, or many of you had here in just a second, but I always want to kind of recap the night because your content is so good, and there's just a couple of things that I noticed that I just wanted to talk a little bit about. So kind of the first one that I had, and Jesse and I were actually talking about this, my wife, she was like, the first question on there, what do you think when you think of intimacy? And she's like, well, before tonight, sex. Like I thought like that was the word, and she was really encouraged by like just all the different levels of intimacy and versions of intimacy and things like that. So all that to say, how important is sex in a marriage?
It's not that important. I mean, I would just tell you, like, it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
I'm kidding. Everyone out there's ticked now. They're like,
Yeah,
what?
that's
What?
right.
It's a big deal. It's a really big deal. But it can't be the only deal. So I think it needs to be there. You need to have that kind of connection, but we want to diversify a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that was just a really life-giving way of sharing about it. So thank you so much for doing that and putting the thought in around that. I was thinking about, as you were talking about knowing yourself and different things like that, and so I think a lot of us maybe have taken some steps toward knowing ourselves. Maybe we haven't at all, but let's just pretend like we've gone through a journey a bit of getting to know ourselves a little bit and then growing into knowing what we need, and then growing even more to being able to communicate our need to our partner. So that's
a lot of growth.
It really, really is. And so I even wanted to just kind of space those things out because depending upon where you're at, you could be anywhere on that journey because that's actually a lot.
Yeah.
But let's just say you've gotten it. You've known yourself a bit, you've identified your needs, and you figured out a way to ask your needs to your partner. And then you do that, and your partner doesn't respond in the way that you would want them to. They don't fulfill your needs, or they don't thank you for sharing your needs. They just don't respond in the way that you want. What next?
Yeah. Well, I think that'd be a bummer, right? Because
Yeah.
there's a disconnect there. I think what becomes really important is to explain why it matters to you. Okay, so sometimes if you share a need with your partner that isn't really important to them, it can be easy for them to dismiss it because it's not that important. And so if we show up and we kind of explain why it is so important to us, the chances are our partner's going to connect with that. And if they don't connect with that, they might connect with the emotions you feel when that doesn't happen, right? So when you say, like, if we're not connecting this way, it makes me feel sad and lonely, they can connect with that feeling. Now, they might not know what it's like to see it that way, but they connect with how you feel. So we're just trying to find a connection point.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. So we can hop into some of the questions that we got. But before I do, I just wanted to just share kind of a little bit of a caveat around some of these questions. So Jason and I actually talked quite a bit today, which was really, really nice kind of throughout the day as we were preparing for the evening. And we talked through this idea, like some of the questions can kind of skew just a little bit negative. And that's okay because what these questions are is they're raw. And they're real and they're true to form, and everything in me wanted to sanitize some of these questions and twist them a little bit to make them a little bit more palatable for all of us. But at the same time, like, if we can't get vulnerable and ask some of these questions, some of these real questions that are happening, then I don't know if we can grow as much as maybe we could. So that's one caveat, is that I kept these questions intentionally raw, but because they're kept as is, some of them might not be like completely specific to your situation. So I just want to challenge you to try to apply some of these concepts to your specific circumstance. And then final caveat that I have is Jason and I are very much a work in progress when it comes to this stuff. And so we're just both a couple of married guys who are trying to figure it out.
Right.
I loved your dog illustration about how, like, just don't be offended, just be happy to be there in some places. And I was thinking about last night, my wife and I just got done with a particularly heated volleyball game. And on the way home, I was like, hey, like, why do you listen to me? I was giving you really good coaching. And she was like, I don't need your help. And, and then we just like drove in silence on the rest of the way home. So like, I need to be a dog, I need to be a dog and not like a
She might think you are already, though.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly right. But like, I'm just so easily offended at times and things like that. So I have just so much to grow. But as we kind of ask these and answer these questions, just know that we're all just trying to work on some of these things. So
Yeah, and if I would just add to, I'm going to do my best to answer them in a way that's helpful, but I don't have a lot of context. I just have the question. So if you were courageous and you wrote the question and you hear me answer it and you go, wait, Jason, if you only knew this, you'd say something different, you might be right. Right? So I'm going on what I have, and I'm going to try to point you in a direction. But if you hear something and you think that doesn't fit, ask somebody else, because it's important just to ask those questions.
yeah, that's good. So these two questions are two separate questions, but are similar. But I wanted to read them both because I think they're important. So the first question: if your spouse gets upset because he or she doesn't think you're doing your part cleaning the house, when you both work full-time jobs and you both have to exercise and you both have 2 kids, is that an expectation from them or a want from them? And then the other question that's tied to it: what is the best way to get your spouse to step up and help out more with the children and household chores?
Sure. Well, I don't know if it's an expectation or a want. That's something you have to talk about, right? So we can have expectations, but again, we want to keep them pretty short and small. And so this happens to be one of yours where you say, like, it's really important to me that this is equal or that I feel this is fair. Okay, like that's fine, but that's just one of your things. So I think first is to kind of talk about that. And then I think to talk about what it means to you when it doesn't happen. Because it just might not be that important to your partner, or they might not see it the way you do. So sometimes just our personality, again, might be that you're kind of messy or you're kind of quirky and you forget stuff. And so if that's how you're wired, that might be deeply offensive to your partner, because they might say like, geez, I'm doing all this stuff. I want it to be more fair and you just keep stepping on me. When in reality, they might just see something else as more important, and they might be saying like, well, I'm trying to do this for you. So it's kind of getting on the same page about like what is really important and how do I help you with it.
That's good. Those questions are just so relatable, because I just wonder, like, all of us are kind of dealing with that. We all have, well, if you're anything like my wife and I, who are both like youngest kids, we both just like, whenever we do anything around the house, it's like, look what I did. Look at how I'm helping. Look at how I'm doing this and that around the house. And I feel like that is what a lot of these questions are, is just like, hey, we both are working full time. We both have 2 kids. We both want to take care of our bodies and all these different things. So like, can you just talk just a little bit more about what it would look like for us to even recognize the work of our spouse, and like, yeah, recognize the work of our spouse and not just think so much about what did I do.
Sure. Yeah, I think some of this is if we understand our spouse, then we know what's difficult for them, right? So if you go, well, they're kind of wired in a way where they don't think about this stuff, but then they did, we can kind of notice the importance. And so I talk to couples a lot about, if we want our partner to keep doing something, be really positive and make it easy to keep doing that, right? So if they do it and you don't notice or say anything, chances are they're not going to keep doing it. And we're all kind of wired like kids that way, no matter how old we get. We just want that affirmation and the positivity. So do it. I know for me, I take out the garbage and I break down the boxes, and every box I break down, I come ask Jody if I did a good job. And she says I did. So then I go back out and I come, no, I'm just kidding you. We don't need that much. But it is helpful. So if you see your partner's trying, make a big deal out of it. Chances are they'll do it again.
Yeah, that's good. There was a specific question about the first night. You talked about rebounding and how long is the appropriate time to rebound. And they asked this specific question, trying to understand where your spouse is coming. Can you define rebound? Are we talking about a complete resolution to the conflict? Or do you mean that we're able to at least function together again, even if it's not completely resolved? What does it mean to rebound?
Yeah, definitely more the second thing, right? So we want to be able to interact and to be cordial to one another, and really just have a shared agreement on what's going to happen next. Now, that might even be what we're going to do next is we're going to talk about it on Tuesday, or we're going to see a counselor and they're going to help us with this. So it doesn't have to be resolution, but we do need to agree on what's happening next. That's the rebound.
That's what rebounding looks like. The next question I want to just kind of talk through generally, because I think many of us can relate to this if we're married. Probably one of the most like lowest hanging comedic fruits in the world is talking about the in-laws, right? Like, oh, my mother-in-law this, mother-in-law that. Spurs from something actually real. Having good relationships with your in-laws can be hard. And one of these questions talked about what happens when it feels like your spouse is really siding with his or her parents when they should be siding with you, or you feel like they should be siding with you. What do you do with that?
Yeah, so the old in-law one, I mean, that, like you said, that's one that comes up a lot. And I think the difficulty is that if we're pushed, we're all really loyal to our parents. Even if they don't deserve it, we're loyal to the people who raised us. And so that can be hard to kind of break out of if we haven't done a lot of work. Because when we do that work, then we can become more objective. And it doesn't mean we have to dislike our parents, but it means we can see people for who they are and then make educated decisions. So some of this is if we haven't done that work, we just can gravitate back towards choosing our folks, which isn't a bad thing, right? But it can be really hurtful to our spouse. So some of what we would need to do is just kind of understand, A, how does it affect your partner when you do that? And then B, what is that about? But also to have some grace and know, like, of course you love your parents. Like, that just makes a lot of good sense. But when we get married, the goal is to break off, right? And so we need to learn how to do that.
Sometimes what I've seen, this is just a case study, not a real story from my experience for sure, but where somebody would rather make your spouse angry than, say, a parent angry.
Sure.
You know? So like
that's a great hypothetical.
It's just a hypothetical. And so like I can kind of level the waters with my wife maybe a little bit easier than a parent or something like that. So that's the route that I take, but that can be really offensive to my spouse. So what advice would you have for this person?
Sure. This hypothetical person. Yeah, okay. I get it. Makes a lot of sense. I mean, we kind of go the path of least resistance. And so if you feel like I can do this and then I'll work it out with her later, okay, like I totally understand that. And it's really hurtful. And over time, we build residue and resentment, and that gets in the way. And so I think the thing is that we just have to do some of our own work and learn how to have a different role. Because it's really tough when we're around our family, and you notice this maybe around the holidays, is that we fall into that role that we grew up in, right? If we don't really try or we don't know ourselves very well, we just kind of gravitate back. And so we have to do some work to kind of know when we're getting there and know what that role is. So if you go, yeah, I know when I see my folks, I get into this pleaser role or whatever, and that's difficult for me because I'm probably going to choose them and not even mean to and hurt my spouse, be aware of that. Like when you go into it, think like, how can I really choose them and make it known and not fall into that?
Yeah, that's good. This was one of my favorite questions that we got because it hopefully speaks to what a lot of us are feeling right now. You're here because we want something better. And this person said, after years of being married but not being on the same team, how can you implement real ways to actively and lovingly be on the same team?
Sure. Well, two things. Remember why you got together in the first place. So you loved each other enough to get married or be in a relationship. Why was that? Were you just making poor decisions, or was that about loving the person? And so sometimes it helps to kind of go back to, like, what did I love about them then that I really dislike about them now? Because that's usually how it works, right? Everyone's like, we're so different, and they say this. And then I see couples, and they're like, they're so different. They say this. And so going back and just kind of seeing it with those fresh eyes that we had at the beginning of the relationship is helpful. Mm-hmm. The second thing is, and I kind of steal this one from business, but businesses don't work if they don't have a mission statement and objectives. Yeah. And so if you are in a relationship where you're not having an agreed upon direction, it's going to be very, very difficult. And so that's a good thing to sit down and do annually or however you want, but to kind of say, like, what are we focused on and where are we going? Mm-hmm. And that gets us on the same page, or at least tells us how far off we are if we're not.
Yeah, that's good. A personal and family kind of vision and mission statement.
Absolutely.
So important to getting on the same team, because you're literally getting on the same team when you're writing all of those things out. So intentionality, that's really good. You talked about the 6 kind of different types of intimacy. Maybe we, in our groups or in our kind of pairs, we were able to talk about maybe some that we are good at, not so good at. What happens when you're just completely on the same, on a different page when it comes to your intimacy and what you're good at, what you're not good at? How do you come together?
Perfect. You have an opportunity to grow, and you have someone to teach you. Yeah. So you say, this part comes really easy to me. I'll teach you about it. And for them, they can teach you about their part. So it's really a growth opportunity. I think sometimes we see it as being something that's really in the way or an obstacle. But when I talk about role models, our partner can be our role model sometimes, right? Maybe our partner does spiritual intimacy way better than we do. We can learn from them. So I don't see it as a disconnect. I see it as a pretty cool opportunity.
What if you just don't know how? What if your spouse is really good at emotional intimacy, and they want to go deep and they want to have these conversations, and you just can't. You might want to, but you just can't go there. You don't know what words to say, whatever it is. What would be some steps?
Sure. Well, there's books. I mean, there's books, but I don't always know about books. There's a great book, actually one of my favorite books is called You Can't Teach a Kid to Ride a Bike at a Conference, because you can't just read about it, right? Like you have to do it. So emotional intimacy is a lot like that. You don't get good at it unless you do it. So find people to practice with. Maybe it's a good friend where you feel like you can be vulnerable and say stupid stuff. They never hold it against you. Or maybe you just ask your spouse. You say, like, this to me seems like a perfect opportunity to say something really profound, and I don't know what to say. Like, what would a person say here if it was good? And they'll know, right? They'll say, like, well, you might say this, and they can teach you about this.
Yeah, that seems really messy. Because so let's just say your partner is really good at that thing, and you're just not good at it yet. And maybe for the first couple of times, they'll hold your hand through it. But after a while, it might get kind of wearing, like, why can't you just get this? Why can't you just learn this after a while? I'm just trying to dig in just a little bit because I feel like some of us are just there, and maybe we're just hitting the same wall over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on that at all?
Ask for help. Yeah, ask for help. So I get it if that partner's frustrated, but at the same time, they're probably not as good as something as you are. So, I mean, we have to kind of go, or we're trying to help each other grow, or what are we trying to do here?
Yeah.
And sometimes it might be annoying for them if you're not good at that, but then ask for help. Mm-hmm. In my experience, people who say they're no good at emotional intimacy, they're just not good with certain people. It's not that they're no good at it. They can do it in the right spot and with the right people. They just aren't good at it with their partner. So for people that say, like, I'm just not good at it, maybe, but probably that's not the case. Probably it's just you have to get more comfortable with this audience than the one you're used to.
Yeah, that's good. So I have one more question, but before I do, I just want to encourage everyone here who's kind of joined in and taken some steps in this process. It kind of reminds me of kind of working out for the very first time or getting back into working out, and it's really like tiring, and you really feel like you don't do anything. And often, like sometimes I'll work out after not working out for a while, and I'll just kind of lay on the floor, just sweating for a little while, and not really do anything.
That never happens to me,
yeah,
ever.
That's right.
That's never.
But I think that we're always going to be, if we took that step of actually going to the gym and laying on the floor sweating, and we took that step of coming to these marriage groups and took some steps forward, even if it doesn't feel like we're taking these big strides, we're further along than what we were before.
Right.
And what I've actually seen, just even over the last couple of months, just as a pastor here, is that so many people that seem like they have it all together on the outside are really hurting right now. And I've just had more conversations than maybe normal lately of just people who are just broken and people who I never imagined they would be. And so if that's you out there right now, just know that you are seen, and there is a way forward for you. And some of the stuff that we're talking about here will take some big strides, but there is a community around you as well that loves you and cares for you. And we would be so honored if you'd be willing to raise your hand and let us help you along the journey. Not literally raise your hand, but just help you along the journey because you are not alone in some of this stuff. So with that, the final question here. How do you keep your marriage? It says here young and healthy. This person actually, they said they've only been married for 7 years, so they probably are.
Oh, like you are so much farther ahead than me.
Yeah, exactly.
I wouldn't be asking that question at that point, but that's good for them.
Young and healthy, 7 years in. Young and healthy as the years goes on, like dating days. I need to learn to divide my time with my children and my husband. It's been rocky at some point, but God continues to pull us together. So again, how do you just keep moving forward, dividing time, spouse and kids and all these things, and keep yourself healthy in your marriage?
Yeah, well, it's challenging. I mean, if you have kids, I've got kids, and so I understand that whole balance thing, but we need to invest in our future. And so to me, bar none, and I swear I don't work for a travel agency, but bar none, taking trips together is really important, having experiences. And that doesn't even have to be like a big plane flight thing. Like that could be driving a half hour away and checking out a museum or doing something like that. But the more that we have those experiences and bring new things in, it rejuvenates our marriage. I think sometimes where I see couples get the most stuck and living in the past is when they're not doing anything. When I say, well, what's like the last time you guys had fun together? And they go, well, we don't do anything. well, then it is really hard to see that. And so I think if you can kind of have fresh stuff coming in, and that's difficult with kids, but it becomes even more important after the kids leave. Because if you don't know how to do that, you guys are going to be super bored for a really long time. So keep it interesting.
Yeah, that's good. That's great advice. Well, I'm gonna just close out just by praying for us. So if you'd be willing to, we'll just finish out the night with a prayer. Jesus, we thank you so much again for just a time and a space to talk about something as important as marriage, a union that you invented, God. So we just thank you so much for it. And I just pray a blessing over anyone who's hearing my voice right now, who's in a marriage union or headed that way. Lord, I just pray a blessing on their marriage. I pray that you would be in the center of it. Your word talks about a cord of 3 strands is not easily broken, Lord, and you are the 3rd strand, Lord. So I just pray that you would strengthen marriages even right now, that you would seal the things that Jason has taught us, or even that our partner has taught us through this process, Lord, and that we'd be able to grow and move forward in a really, really healthy way. God, just show us what maybe even our next step is right now toward a healthy marriage, toward a marriage that lasts for years and years and years, Lord, and one that we not only just endure but thrive in. God, we love you. We thank you for Jesus. We pray in his name. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Can we put it up one last time for Jason?
Thank you.
Jason, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks for joining us. Take care.